Good afternoon, everybody. We are going to, there we go. Okay, we're going to now take a look at a very, very important section of the Torah. This week's Parsha is certainly one of the most, it's one of the most significant readings in the Torah, because in it we really get a kind of for the first time, a kind of a picture of what Jewish or Torah's, Jewish is like an anachronistic word, right? They're still the Israelites. What is the Torah's vision for their state? They have become a people, but they have not become a state. That won't happen until after the Torah. So there's much of the Torah there are laws aplenty, no doubt, but it takes place in this kind of wandering, tribal system that is immediate and practical and temporary, hopefully. But in this week's reading, we begin to get a picture of what it might look like once they actually cross over the Jordan and come into this land. What are they going to do there? So this is an important Torah reading in any case. I feel that it is especially important at this moment, and I've thought about this reading a lot in these last months since the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement and protests, because part of what that movement has forced us to do, encouraged us to do, asked us to do, is to really reconceive of the entire structure of our justice system, right? And I think, and it's difficult to reconceive. You take for granted the society you have around you. So when we hear calls for, the elimination of police, I think many of us sort of instinctively, it's not that we object or approve. It's like, it doesn't make any sense, like initially. It's very hard for me. I am at the point where, a lot of conversations have been had, a lot of reading has been done, and a lot of debates are taking place in our society. And I have a better sense of, what would it look like to reimagine the implementation of justice in our society? But that takes some rethinking for me, just because, I don't know, I grew up with cops. It doesn't make sense that there wouldn't be police. That's a given. And it's actually not a given. None of the features of our government, or our justice system are inevitable, right? There are many different justice systems and many different state structures. And the Torah presents us with one. And as we'll soon see, the system that the Torah presents us with is, I think, quite different than anything. It is something that, like the sort of suggestions that have emerged in the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement, initially when we read the Torah's description, it seems strange and impossible. But it is so valuable, even if whether we first of all, we're Jews, and this seems like a significant part of our canon and of our legacy, is to understand, well, what government does this ancient civilization advise? But I find it particularly valuable to read through this sort of text, because it allows us to step outside for a moment of our own context and to question all of our assumptions, and to rethink what is an ideal state, what is an ideal justice system. Okay, so part of this is just getting to know what is it that Shoftim advises, But part of this, in this season of reflection and repentance, is in the service of doing that work that feels so necessary at this moment in our history, of really thinking about the tshuva that we need to do on a national level, on a state level, on a political level. Right? There's personal tshuva, there's communal tshuva, there's environmental tshuva, but a lot of what we have been doing as a nation over these last months is trying to think about what tshuva is required for, and by tshuva I mean maybe repentance, but maybe just correction, maybe refiguring, reconstructing, some sort of real thinking about, well, what would a really just society look like? And in this, there are many ways to ask that kind of question, but in this case, I'm really talking about the structure of justice in the society, the official state mechanisms of justice. Okay, so with all that said, there's a lot in Parshat Shoftim. I have a fear that there's no way we'll be able to really map it all out, but as I started to review it last night and think like what I wanted to teach, there's a part of me that feels like, oh, let's just spend all our time on the first 3 verses because they're famous. And once we read them, many of you will remember them, but they're also, they're worth an entire hour. And I hope actually we won't spend the entire hour because I want to show you some of the larger structure, but just these opening verses are powerful. And I think in some respects startling. They contain a famous injunction that apparently Ruth Bader Ginsburg has up in her office. So may our learning today be towards the health and long life of RBG. Okay, so let's take a look. We are going to, I'll share with you the source sheet and then we'll take a look at it inside. Sorry, a little Zoom weirdness today, so I'm a little clunky. Pardon me. Okay, here comes the source sheet in the chat, if you wish. And now we're going to look at it together. Okay, so here's where it begins, and you really feel it. The tone is very different in this parsha, and it's even the parsha takes its name from this opening line, shoftim, and that's the word that we're going to spend most of our time thinking about today. A shofet. What is a shofet? What is this role that the Torah is putting right out at the forefront of its governmental structure, and how do we think of a shofet in Jewish tradition? So a shofet is easily translated as a judge, and we're going to translate it that way. But as we'll see over the course of our discussion, it's not exactly clear whether that means what we tend to think it means. So let's take a look first at these opening lines. Shoftim v'shotrim titen lecha b'chol sha'arecha she'Adonai Elohecha noten lecha lishvatecha v'shaftu et ha'am mishpat tzedek. You shall appoint judges, that's shoftim, and officers, shotrim. Now, we'll try and figure out what these are as well, because there are actually 2 roles that are thrown out to us at the opening here. Shoftim and shotrim. So judges and officers for your tribes in all the settlements the Eternal your God is giving you, and they will judge the people with just judgment. Very, very kind of like repetitive language here. B'shaftu et ha'am mishpat tzedek. Same root here for judge, judging, and judgment, mishpat. But there's another word that we are, usually we translate it as justice, but you might also translate as righteousness or correctness. Someone who is correct is sodek, and when you give charity, we don't call it charity, we call it tzedakah, right? What you are supposed to give. So that is the root here is something like correct, right, appropriate, but we translate it as justice, okay? I'll just read through and then we're gonna go and take this verse by verse. You shall not render biased judgment. You shall show no partiality. You shall not take bribes, for bribes blind the eyes of the discerning and upset the plea of the just. And here's the famous line, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice shall you pursue, leman tichiyeh v'yarashta et haaretz asher Adonai Elohecha noten lach, so that you may thrive and occupy the land that the Eternal your God has given you. Okay, so this is like pretty stark and skeletal. But what do you think we have so far? What are we being told? This is the major injunction. You shall appoint judges and officers for your tribes in all the settlements. The word here is sha'arecha, in all your gates, probably because cities back then were walled and had a gate of entrance to them. So you'll have judges and officers in each of your gates, and they shall judge the people with just judgment. Okay? So what now? That's a commandment. What do we do? Maybe a better way to ask the question is, what's new here? What's new here? Like, okay, so we need judges. Haven't we had judges before? Right? Like, we've seen judges before. We have, do anyone remember, where have we seen judges appointed before? Quiet group today. Austin, what's up?
Oh. I know with like the daughters, when they, I forget the name, sorry, I'm super new. The daughters of the man who had died.
Oh, yeah, that's right. That's right. The daughters of Tzlofchad.
Okay.
That's right. They bring a case before Moses, and Moses doesn't know how to answer it, and so Moses turns to God. That's a great example, Austin, of judgment taking place in the Torah. And in fact, the judge, the ultimate judge in the Torah, in the story of the Torah, is Moses, right? And Moses, we first encounter as a judge before we even get the Ten Commandments, right? Before there is even law, there's a whole narrative that describes Moses sitting as the judge and rendering judgment for people who come to, he sits all day long as people come and ask him, in exactly the way the daughters of Tzlofchad did. They ask him for, what's your opinion on this? How do we do this? How do we live our lives? How do we practice this? How do we practice the Sabbath? I've got a debate with my business partner. Someone smashed into my car. Probably not in the desert, but my ox. Someone smashed into my ox. And Moses would sit and judge the people. So this is, in some ways, it's like a hallmark ancient institution, right? And not only that, but in that narrative, we learn that Moses's job is so massive that he's going to need help, and his father-in-law recommends that he do what we are being told to do in Parshat Shoftim. Listen to me, he says, I will give you counsel and God be with you. You represent the people before God, you bring the disputes before God, and enjoin upon them the laws and teachings and make known to them the way they are to go and the practices they are to follow. You shall also seek out from among all the people, capable men who fear God, trustworthy men who spurn ill-gotten gain. Set these over them as chiefs of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens, and let them judge the people at all times. There's that word again. Let them judge the people at all times. Have them bring every major dispute to you, but let them decide every minor dispute themselves. Make it easier for yourself by letting them share the burden with you. Okay, so that's good. So okay, now we've got some sense of, oh, this is already part of the story. Moses already served as a judge, and Moses appointed a bunch of other judges. Moses will be the high court, and they'll be the sort of lower court. So now, again, what's new in our parsha? we've already got judges. Why is our parsha going out of its way to tell us to appoint judges? We've already got them. Nick?
Well, now we're scaling up from the community just being a giant encampment in the desert to cities, which would also include the Levitical, the manslayer cities too. So there's going to be like different laws for the different places, So, and also I think Moses is trying to prepare the people for a post-Moses world, because now they need to be able to build a justice system on their own without him.
Great. Okay, so one thing we learn is that it's not just Moses and his crew of judges, but that every locale will have to have a court. Every locale will have to have at least a judge, or maybe several judges, not clear from the verse. But as we begin to conceive of our system of governance, the first thing that we want is a court in every city. Okay. David, were you going to add to that? No. Kathy? Hal?
Yeah, well, one thing that struck me about this is that it's not clear whether the judges are specifically serving a tribe. I mean, are the cities just one tribe? Are they multiple? So that seems a little different, in that instead of dealing with the people as a whole, which Moses did, you're subdividing into different tribes.
Yeah, that's right. The language of tribes for all of your tribes is out here too. So we have Nick picked up on Sha'arecha, all the settlements or gates or cities, and Hal is picking up on the tribes. So now it seems like every city has a judge. Each tribe has their own court system, you can imagine. Then this is not so wild for us to imagine. It's like the Ninth Circuit, the Second Circuit. There are court systems that are specific to a tribe, which is, after all, a domain in the land, right? Each tribe has a plot of land. And then within the tribal plot, every city has its own judge. It's a lot of judges. It's like, this is a very strong request from the Torah, that we really imagine that everywhere we go in the land, there are judges. Okay, it's really, really prominent, really at the forefront of this beginning of a description of a state. Wendy?
I think this is really a radical thing. You're talking about a people who were slaves. And granted, we've spent 40 years in the desert trying to evolve out of that slavehood state of mind. And we've had Moses, and this was also radical for Moses to have judges, because Yitro suggested, hey, this is too hard for you to do. And now, and also in Torah, the ultimate judge is God. And now we're having this there's a formalization saying we need to be able to judge each other, but in a very specific guideline sort of way. And this is, I think this is a big step for people, because it's not going to be random judgment here. There's very specific things that are said. There's a delineation. How do you deal with people who have murdered when it's an accident? How do you deal with different kinds of things? But also how the judges judge. That there has to be some kind of guideline, some kind of way that judges can be judges. And that's huge, I think, for people.
Great. So this is important. Wendy is beginning to ask the question, what does the judge do? No question that this is a bold implementation of the prominence of the judicial system in this society. But what do they do exactly? What are we imagining that a judge does? Because when we heard about Moses judging, it seemed just like, well, whatever comes up, just bring it before me, and I don't know, like, what did Moses do? And what do you think these judges are doing? I mean, don't we have the Torah? Isn't God the ultimate judge? What is it exactly that the judges are doing? So that should be part of our conversation. Elizabeth? You're muted.
I think the part about having the officers is very important. because you can have judges saying that this is wrong or right, but if you don't have enforcement afterwards, which would come from the officers, then then the judgment doesn't really go anywhere. I think that's really the novel piece of this, is you shall have judges, but you will also appoint officers. And the officers are there to take the judgment and actually enforce what the judges have decided, I think.
I think you're right. Elizabeth, it's very important to quickly remind us before we get too far into this discussion of who these judges are, that in the same breath, we got shoftim v'shotrim, these two roles. And Elizabeth, we've translated them here as officers. Elizabeth describes them as the people who would implement or enforce, I think is the word you used, enforce the law, right? So who are those people? Like what is the name that we use for those people in our society?
Police.
Police, right? And in fact, this word is often translated in modern Hebrew. A shoter is a police officer, and this is even in it may be a little anachronistic, but it is often translated in the Torah as judges and police officers, right? But let's not too quickly, we don't know exactly what judges are. We also don't know exactly what these enforcers are. What are these, what is a shoter? Well, we have one clue that I'd like to offer, which we looked back in Exodus when Moses appointed all of these judges. There's another point in the Torah where a team of seeming judges are appointed, but it comes much later when Moses is complaining that he can't carry the burden of the people by himself, and God appoints a council of 70 elders. Now, they are not called judges, but it's hard not to think of them that way because this is the template, the model for the Sanhedrin, right? The 70 elders will be seen as the source of the council of judges. But take a look at the language here. This comes up in the book of Numbers. Again, Moses is sort of exasperated, cannot deal with the people anymore. And God says, the Eternal One says to Moses, gather for me 70 of Israel's elders, of whom you have experience as elders, and officers of the people. Right, there's that word, shotrav. And bring them to the tent of meeting and let them take their place there with you. I will come down and speak with you there, and I will draw upon the spirit that is on you and put it upon them, and they shall share the burden of the people with you, and you shall not bear it alone. Okay. So there's judges, and then there's these officers. How do you read, like, God appointed 70 officers. So what does that mean? Well, how do you read, what are the officers there to do for Moses? Or now, there to do for the judges? How do you see this playing out? Let's see here, Marlene.
I was actually going to comment back a little bit about how do we know who's going to be the judge? How are we going to select the judges and these officers? Because it seems like that's a really big piece of it. Like, what criteria are we going to use for them? And that may help determine what they do or what they're capable of doing.
Okay, that's really important.
About that yet. I'm kind of waiting to say who gets to be a judge. We have the model of the Sanhedrin, but that's 70 old guys. Maybe there's some young people who are, assuming men at that point only, who are just as capable of pursuing justice. So we don't really know what the selection criteria are going to be for either category.
Okay, that's important. Yeah, you're right. We were sort of glazing past that, but it's true. These earlier texts also give us a sense of who are judges supposed to be. They're supposed to be trustworthy. They're supposed to be unbiased. They're supposed to be capable. And who are these officers supposed to be? Well, they're experienced as elders of the people, right? It's funny because that you don't think of like old police officers, right? So there's something of, like, who are these officers? Like, what are they supposed to do? Okay, Kathy.
I mean,
Wow.
it's like the executive branch, right? You have the judicial branch, the legislative branch in this case is God, and so the people who who creates the laws, and so these are the people who administer them.
Okay, that's great. Perfect. So that language is going to be really helpful to us, right? In our system, we have an executive, a legislative, and a judicial branch of government, right? And the executive is the federal government, the president, and everybody working under the president. Now, we speak of these three branches of government in our society as co-equal. They're checks and balances. They're all, but it certainly seems, or at least our sort of cultural conversation seems to place the executive branch on top. Right? Like the president sort of seems to be in charge. That we at least like report on or speak about the executive branch as if it were the leadership of the country. If that is so, then what is the leadership of the state that the Torah envisions? Which branch? Hal says God is the legislative branch, right? Because that's the Torah. The judges are the judicial, and then whoever these officers of the court are, that's the executive branch. They carry out, they implement the law. Who's in charge? Seems like it got to be God, right? But I mean, what do you think? Who's in charge? Who's at the top of this system? All right. Well, let's keep going. Let's see what we see inside. Okay. Next verse here. So you appoint these judges and officers in your tribes, and then verse 19 is interesting. You shall not render biased judgment. You shall show no partiality. You shall not take bribes, for bribes blind the eyes of the discerning and upset the plea of the just. Who are we talking to here? Who shall not render biased judgment? I mean,
Judges.
The judges, surely. But that's a shift in the form of address here. You appoint judges, verse 18, and then the Torah turns to talk to the judges. You judges shall act in accordance with justice and fairness. And then, justice shall you pursue, that you may thrive and occupy the land that the eternal your God has given you. Who are we talking to here? Who is being addressed in this verse? The judges?
Everyone.
Everyone. Okay. So this last line here, justice shall you pursue. Right? You shall build a just society. That is all of our responsibility, but it is the coda to the appointment of judges. In other words, the judicial system here is the primary mechanism by which we establish a just society. Okay? And I think, I'm going to make the claim as we move forward, that the Torah imagines that judges are actually in charge. Judges are actually the leadership of this society, more so than the officers, more so than any kind of executive figure. The judges are really the leaders of this society, okay? So let me just try and make that case, and then I want to sort of hear what you think about that model. So let's take a look just a few lines further in the book of Deuteronomy, where the function of the judges is described in greater detail. If a case is too baffling for you to decide, be it a controversy over homicide, civil law, or assault matters of dispute in your courts, you shall promptly go up to the place that the Eternal your God will have chosen and appear before the Levitical priests or the judge in charge at the time and present your problem. When they have announced to you the verdict in the case, you shall carry out the verdict that is announced to you from that place the Eternal chose, observing scrupulously all their instructions to you. You shall act in accordance with the Torah shown to you, that should say to you, and the judgment handed down to you, you must not deviate from the verdict that they announced to you, either to the right or to the left. Okay? So this is the mechanism by which disputes are settled in this society. You go up to where? Who are these judges? What is it? Yeah.
They're like the Supreme Court.
Good. We have judges in every single locality. We have judges for every tribe. We have judges in every city. But when cases are too difficult or disputed or cannot be handled at the local level, there is a Supreme Court, right? There is, and where is this place that you're going? They're telling you go up to the place that God will choose. Where is that place? The place where God will choose is like it's a refrain in the book of Deuteronomy. It's a reference. Yeah, Noah?
Isn't that where like the Mishkan will be kind of established once they get into the land?
That's right. It's the temple, right? The Beit HaMikdash, the great temple. And it is true that the great edifice of the temple, by tradition, was attached to the building where the Sanhedrin met. Okay? So the holy site of the temple was also the place where the high court sat. So you have this, like the White House, right, so to speak, the Kremlin, the whatever it is, that place was the place where the Supreme Court sat, okay? Now, so we're like, I'm trying to build a case that judges are very prominent, judges are there in the central building, you take all your disputes to judges, or the judges have these officers that carry out the ruling of the judges, right? So sure, I guess judges are a big part of this governmental structure, but wait a minute, like what about, don't we have other official roles that need filling in this society? What is another classic Jewish political institution? Eventually, there's a whole book that discusses the kings of Israel, right? So that's right. Well, there's your executive branch. Why am I spinning us all around, keeping talking about judges and judges and judges? And okay, so we need judges, and there will be courts. But there are other government officials, are there not? Well, famously, in this same parsha, we get a description of the kings of Israel. And it is a description that is, I say famously because it's famously ambiguous. It reads like this: if after you have entered the land that the Eternal your God has assigned to you and taken possession of it and settled in it, you decide, I will set a king over me as do all the nations about me. You shall be free to set a king over yourself, one chosen by the Eternal your God. Be sure to set a king over yourself of one of your own people. You must not set a foreigner over you, one who is not your kinsman, or even one who is under the control of Russian dictator. But that's the idea. The idea is that you can have a king. So why am I making such a big deal about the judges? The king is really in charge. There's a king, for goodness sake. Right? Judges will serve the same function they do in our society. What is the difference between the judges and the king that you're seeing here? Let's see, Hannah.
Well, it seems like the judges are kind of at the foundation of all of the ethical things that are being decided or not decided, and that the root of the way that they're conceptualizing a society is that the backbone of it, or the foundation of it, has to be rooted in ethics, and that the king kind of becomes a figurehead of sorts, and yeah, maybe is making the decisions to some extent, or especially about war or about other things, but that actually the core of who are we and how do we manifest that in our day-to-day lives, that's in the judicial part of things. That's where the judges are, and that's what we're encouraged to do, I think, much of the time still as Jews. But I think that's the society they've constructed. You have to be ethical first, and who knows about that better than the judges?
Okay, good. Okay, the judges. So that's one thing. I think Hannah's just like is speaking that out very very clearly for us. The judges have a very clear and defined function, and the function is to rule on and communicate matters of the Torah, and to do so ethically, to do so in accordance with principles. The king, I don't know, like not clear what the king's up to actually. But the king is a figurehead, and in fact, all we really read about the king is that you want one like everybody else has a king. Right? The judges have a very clear function. It's a function that has to do with justice, ethics, law. The king, not as clear. What else is different between the judges and the kings? Who's got an answer here? What else is different between the judges and the kings? I'm looking in some ways for a very, Tali.
There's also how they were chosen. So the king was chosen through the Nevi'im, and the placement of that already kind of distinguishes of, a judge has that ethics and the moral, and kind of what Hannah said. The king doesn't have to have any of that. He just has to be kind of under God and uniting people. And there's a very distinct divide there of kind of how they were chosen and for what purposes.
Okay, great. The king's appointment is some kind of mysterious divine thing. The judges is like a system. We choose the judges. We scan through the people looking for the smartest, wisest, most ethical people. And it's a system that we're constantly working through. The king is, again, a kind of figurehead that is divinely appointed. David.
It feels to me, you point a king just like the other nations have. It seems like the king will be the representative of your nation to other nations.
Yeah, I think that's right. Hannah mentioned the king waging war, and I think that the other obvious function, if this is a king like all other nations, is that this will be the king that will talk to the other kings. The king, in other words, the king's primary function is a kind of is foreign relations, right? Diplomacy, war, interacting with other nations, serving as the figurehead of the country. But the king doesn't actually run the country. The king doesn't actually decide things for the people. That's what the judges do, okay? The king is not in charge of law. The king doesn't rule on matters of law. The king doesn't decide the law. The king has some other functions, okay? But now, there's one other critical distinction between the king and the judges. And it's sort of like the famous teaching of this passage in Deuteronomy that said, the famous teaching hinges on this first word, right? The word in Hebrew is ki, and it's translated here as if. Now, it actually could also be translated as when, and so there's a debate in the tradition, but the presumption by most interpreters, and frankly by the prophets themselves in later books of the Tanakh, is that the institution of the king is optional. It is optional. You do not have to have a king. In fact, Samuel, the prophet, believes very strongly that you should not appoint a king. And why should you not appoint a king? Why would it be bad to appoint a king? Because God is our king. God is in charge. We don't want some human being who's the leader, who's like the head, the more important person. That's not our ideal society, right? But judges, you do have to appoint. Judges are mandatory, okay? That's a huge distinction. So let's think for a second about the institutions we've seen so far. We have judges, officers, kings, okay? Officers work for the judges, and kings are disconnected but don't even have to be appointed. So I hope you can feel, as we begin to describe this system, that it really is ultimately the judges who are in charge of this society. If there is any leadership at all, it is the judges, okay? All right, let's see. I wanted to make sure I call on people I haven't called on before, but the question that I now want to turn to is a very basic question. I spent some time here laying out the system, but I want to know, what do you think of that system? Does it make sense? Can you imagine a society in which the Supreme Court is in charge and the president and Congress are lesser institutions, right? Like that I think is the thought experiment that the Torah is inviting us to undertake right now. So what do you think of that sort of society? Alexandra?
I think, to me, as I'm reading this, and as you're reading it, it seems like the notion in that society of prophecy is sort of embedded into the role of judges, or at least the way that I was reading it and understanding it. The idea that the place where God determines, and the judges are very well vetted and experienced. And so if that is the case, and this is a society in which prophecy is sort of a presupposition for the role in the government, then I think it makes perfect sense. But otherwise, it's problematic.
Why problematic?
Because one does need checks and balances when there are humans running the show.
Okay, great. So maybe the great genius of the American system is and it's not just America, right? Like who first formulated this? Montague? Hal's about to say it. I'm forgetting the name. But right, this idea of checks.
Montesquieu.
What's that?
Montesquieu.
Montesquieu. That the idea is that no branch of government should have supreme authority. And maybe what the Torah is envisioning here is a kind of rule of the wise, right? The scholars are supreme here. The judges are actually in charge here, and Alexandra is saying, well, that's fine if they're Moses. If the judges are imbued with a spirit of prophecy, well, then I guess, isn't that the whole thing? God's in charge. But if we're just talking about regular human beings, maybe this is just as dangerous a system as a dictatorship. It's just that there are a team of dictators instead of just one. Okay, other thoughts? Yael?
Yes, one thing that's disturbing me is that you're skipping over those who are implementing the justice. And as we can see in our country, they have significantly more power than you're allowing. So when you say who's in charge, actually the one in the street who is in charge of implementing the justice has a tremendous amount of power for making it tzedek or non-tzedek. Just as we see it in America, as we've seen for years, but now we're really looking. So I think that Hashem knew what he was doing, because they all have to function together. And when you say who's in charge, I would say everyone's in charge.
So you're saying this, the judges and the officers are not, I'm framing it as if the officers are just working for the judges. But you're saying, no, we know very well that officers have a tremendous amount of power once they're out there implementing the law. So we're actually seeing, in a sense, two branches of government when we speak about shoftim b'shotrim, right? Yeah, okay, great. I think that's a legitimate read. Allison.
Hey.
Hi.
So I think this is really interesting, and I just wanted to pick up on what Alexandra was saying in terms of presenting Moses as kind of like an ideal leader or dictator. I think actually what we've been seeing in this whole section of the Torah is that Moses is deeply flawed, right? Like, I was really struck a couple of parshas ago, I can't remember which one, but there's one where like Moses seems so angry. And twice in the parsha, he blames the Israelites for his own behavior. He says, because of you, God will not allow me into the promised land. But of course, we know that isn't true, right? It's because Moshe struck the rock twice. Of course, the Israelites made him angry, but just because they made him angry doesn't mean that they're responsible for his behavior. That's actually kind of abusive. I think one thing that's interesting is so far in the Torah, we actually do see a sort of check and balance happening between God and Moses. As they feed off each other. One gets really upset and the other one kind of reasons with, God or Moses. And you can even imagine, to a certain extent, there's a three-way balancing that's happening between God, Moses, and the Israelites. Right? Because the Israelites sometimes do protest and do complain. I mean, I'm thinking of the daughters of Zelophehad, but I'm even thinking of the incident of the golden calf or Korach's rebellion. You do see the people kind of trying to go in a different way and challenging Moses and challenging God in these different moments.
That's fair. So we present this idea of judges and the supremacy of judges, and you might say I was sort of in some ways trying to force a reading where these are the scholars, these are the Hannah said earlier, the people trying to operate by a system of ethics. These aren't judges. I sort of am insinuating more trustworthy than politicians, right? Don't you on some level trust someone on the Supreme Court more than you trust a president? Aren't they somehow, I don't know, more educated, immune to bias? And Allison is responding, and no, we've seen even in the Torah's own narrative that judges are not always impartial, and judges are not always wise, and judges are not always even-tempered. And in fact, isn't that the injunction at the beginning of the Torah, of this parsha? You should appoint judges. Now, hey, judges, don't take bribes, right? That's the first thing that we read. You shall appoint judges, and immediately, as soon as we say you should appoint judges, we're tremendously worried that these judges are going to show partiality and take bribes and render biased judgment. So, at first glance, I look at a system where judges are really placed in a position of prominence and dominance, and I think, well, maybe that's better. Maybe judges would do a better job of ruling a society than executives. And very quickly, you all are pushing back and saying, no, like any other institution accorded supreme power, we have to worry now about those people being corrupt, right? So it doesn't work to have a Supreme Court ruling a country without checks and balances any more than it would work to have a president ruling a country without checks and balances. In some ways, I feel like this is a very American group, and so we have that wisdom sort of embedded in us. But okay, let's keep going. Nick.
I also think that the appointment of a king or a regal figure is just a practical sort of thing, considering the fact that a system of just judges would be a total paradigm shift to what's going on in the immediate neighborhood of the land of Israel. I mean, the book of Joshua tells us about how many kings were overtaken and slayed as sort of a bounty and a representative of the preeminence of the God of Israel and of the Israelites, so it's that tells us that there's just kingly systems, so it almost seems well, if we want to be able to navigate this political political reality, then maybe we need a king too, so we can react more nimbly than say a group of judges would be able to. But then of course there's the warning. It doesn't just say tzedek tildof, it's a tzedek tildof, justice you will pursue, not just a limited justice, but a true justice, and don't deviate from to the left or to the right. And we just saw, the blessing and curse on the two mountains and the people in between, sort of going back and forth and saying amen to both, which I think tells us there's like a middle path that we need to like stay on if we want to have some sort of like honesty or justice. And I think it's a warning that's going from the top to the bottom, from this potential king, through the judges, through the enforcers, to the people, that like, we can't just have a justice that's exceptional to what we want, but a justice that is more encompassing. But as far as like on the king itself, I think that it's more of like a practical thing of like, if we're gonna thrive in this region, maybe we need to have a system that's able to speak to the other peoples around us. And, you know, like Melech is also like, you know, has its own variations of like being a messenger too. It's like an emissary. Like the king isn't necessarily the person who rules over us. They're our emissary. And we have to choose that emissary from among us so that emissary can properly represent us to the other nations.
Okay, this is beautiful. What Nick is doing, what's happening here in the group is really like, really very, it's very exciting and impressive to me, because as I said, I'm sort of trying to push a certain vision. I'm sort of trying to sell you on a vision of the justice system as the preeminent institution in the Torah's vision for a government. And you all are pushing back and saying, that's not going to work any better than any other institution reigning supreme. And Nick goes as far as to say, we need the king, right? Yeah, the king is conditional, but you can see here, actually, once we put the judges in this position of having this much authority, you actually start to realize that that might, first of all, they might be corrupt, as Allison said, they might be a hot temper, but also Nick is suggesting a deliberative body is not always the most efficient and effective way to govern a society. So maybe we do need someone who can make more immediate and in the moment and practical decisions. Someone who's not going to pour through the Talmud before they render any verdict before them. That's fine if you have a dispute that needs to be, you know, what do you call it? I'm forgetting all my words today. That needs to be resolved in the course of a trial of a case. But a state has more immediate concerns. What happens when there's a pandemic, right? Now, you would need an effective executive in place, but if you had one, then that would be more effective than a bunch of scholars sitting around thinking about, like, for years, what the best method is to address a pandemic, okay? So what I presented as who cares about the king? It's all about judges. We're kind of circling around to, like, maybe actually we need a king after all. We need a queen after all. We need someone who's actually going to be able to make more immediate and executive decisions. Okay, interesting. Wendy?
Well, I'm going to say a little bit about the king. I think not having a king has set the Jewish people apart from everyone else. And actually, this is the essence of a lot of the ultimate beginnings of much anti-Semitism, because we believe that God is king. There is not a person who is king. And this was one of the things that was said, you know, in the Inquisition. There's a danger that Jews do not look up to a king, that God is our king. And I think, I hear what you're saying, Nick, but I think maybe what I'm getting, maybe that the Torah is trying to say here is that we need people to not have opinion, that there needs to be a rational, balanced set of way of thinking that stems from wisdom. That wisdom is what is important here. Tzaddik, to be wise. And wisdom is not something that's an absolute. I think that's a constant. That's constantly in movement. You know, we learn as we go in life. So I think it feels like we're asked. I mean, we're asked to really. A judge is somebody who steps back and looks at the whole picture. That everything, that it's not just about my opinion, but how does this all work together.
Mm.
And that's what judges are asked to do, I believe, here.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is great. We have a little tension. I'm going to let Nick actually respond to you. Nick, you want to respond to this? Because there's a little...
Yeah, well, I also just wanted to like emphasize that what I was, the big part of what I was saying is that like the king isn't necessarily a person who is more just. It was more of just like a practical acknowledgement of that, like, if we want to build a society that's different from all the other societies around us, it's probably going to be pretty easy for us to be overtaken. So it's just practical to have a king. That doesn't necessarily mean that a kingly system is more just. I think we've seen that it's not. I think it's just like, we're operating from a universalistic point of view right now. But like when this was happening in its time, we were just a nation among many nations. There was no universalism. It was like, we need to be able to interact on a political level. So maybe we need to have a king in order to do that. And that doesn't mean that like, that's an indication of what we think about justice. It's just like, it's practical.
Okay, this is great. I think this is a really good place to leave this conversation in a certain amount of tension, because I think both Wendy and Nick are expressing real values here. And I think Wendy is giving us a kind of idealistic picture, and I actually, the truth is I share it. I was sort of pushing it as well, which is a picture of a society ruled by brilliant and ethically committed people, right? People who are taking the laws, the values, the morals of this society seriously and deliberating over them carefully, and that's who we want in charge. By the way, we're not the only society that has imagined such a system of rulership. The other great example that I can think of is in the Republic, in Plato's Republic, where he speaks of these philosopher kings, right? Philosophers must become kings, so that the people in charge are people who are in possession of wisdom, because wisdom should be in charge. And that's an important value or paradigm to keep in mind. But Nick is reminding us that that's all very fine and well, but there are other concerns, or more practical concerns, more immediate concerns that a society may need other forms of leadership to address, right? And along the way, many of you have have paved the way for Nick by saying, yeah, it's great to think about having wise people in charge of society, except that they can become corrupt too. And they can make mistakes, and they're human beings. The philosopher kings that Plato envisions are actually not kings and elites. They are just human beings like the rest of us. And so we need actually a kind of a multi-tiered system of leadership in this society. So I think these are good kind of tensions to keep in mind. I'll take one last comment, and then we'll leave. Noah?
Oh, I was just, Rabbi, wondering if you could comment on, just given the time of year we're in, it seems like on the subject of kingship and judgment, right? All of this does, at least in our theology, seem to crush together at this time of year, right? We're enthroning God as king at the same time that we're preparing for God to sit in judgment. Do you think there's anything to be learned, maybe just with the idea that we are needing in our lives to separate those things out? I guess part of what I'm saying is that that life is very complicated, right? And that we have all these kind of broken pieces of a world we're trying to build together. And that maybe sometimes a year it's nice to live in an absolutist theological mindset where you can have one pure thing. And then the rest of the time it's pretty much massive confusion, figuring out how to be effective, how to be just. And like, in what way does enthroning God as king and as judge maybe reflect what our reality is for the rest of the year?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think that, I think that you all have done a great job of pushing back against the absolute authority of the judge, or even just the the romanticizing of the court institution. Right? You pointed out that these people can be corrupt and can be human, like the rest of us. But I do think that they at least represent a certain kind of ideal. Right? The judge, as the most prominent figure of leadership in the Torah, means, and starting with Moses, represents a leader who is committed to learning, a leader who is committed to fairness, a leader who's committed to being free of all monetary gain, right? A leader who is committed to the laws of the country, to really trying to understand and implement in a fair way the laws of the country. These are basic things, but we're heading up into a presidential election, and I think part of what this parsha reminds us is that we don't often speak of those things in relationship to the president or to the king, right? Think about other things, strong leadership or charismatic, or right? But when we know that when we appoint judges, we want scholars who can be trusted, who lead ethical lives. Right? It's easier to speak of those things in the office of the judge. And so I think that we should at least, I don't think we should necessarily advocate for a system run by the Supreme Court, but we should at least ask of all of our branches of government these same questions. Are these people going to be impartial? Are they going to seek their own gain? Are they going to bend the law to their own desire? Right? Are they going to be well-read? Are they going to be wise? These are things that matter. They matter. And so we have to really ask these questions, even as we think about different sort of systems of governance. So may we make may we select well this in this coming season. Okay, thanks everybody. Appreciate your thoughts, your pushback, your wisdom as we move through this
wonderful class. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Wow, really awesome.
Thank you, Yael.
I don't want it to end. Thank you.
There's a lot more to say, that's for sure.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye, everyone. Be well.
Everybody.